Difficulty is one of the main defining features of any Fire Emblem game, but it's not the only thing that matters. Hello, I'm Emblem, and today I'd like to talk to you about the difficulty-flexibility trade-off in Fire Emblem game design. The difficulty of Fire Emblem games is typically defined by the strength of enemy forces in comparison to that of the players. In most cases, harder difficulty manifests in the form of enemies having higher stats. But as difficulty increases, it tends to expect more from the player, restricting the particulars of how they form and train their army. Fire Emblem as a series has a large focus on individual playthroughs being unique and different, sometimes in substantial ways, depending on which units you use and how lucky or unlucky you are with the randomized stat growths when you level up. The degree to which this happens is a concept I call flexibility. Flexibility, as I define it, is the degree to which the game can accommodate multiple different desired playstyles and strategies. The more viable options that you have in terms of choosing which units to use and how to use them, the more flexible the game will be. But the nature of difficulty in Fire Emblem means that as the game gets harder, you tend to have fewer valuable strategic options. On the extreme ends, when the difficulty is at its highest, maps can feel like a puzzle with only a few correct solutions. But if the difficulty is too easy, then you can just brainlessly steamroll through by using any strategy or lack thereof that you want. This dynamic is the difficulty-flexibility trade-off, where increasing either of the two will inevitably decrease the other. As you increase difficulty, flexibility will tend to go down, and as you increase flexibility, difficulty will tend to go down. This plays out in multiple ways in different Fire Emblem titles, and the degree to which this can happen can change even within an individual game. An example of a high difficulty, low flexibility segment in Fire Emblem is the prologue sequence of Fire Emblem 12. This is even more notable on Lunatic difficulty. The maps are ridiculously small, and you need to make very specific moves or use very specific strategies and builds to make it through without losing characters. Maps like these effectively become puzzles where the number of solutions that you have are limited, often requiring a ton of trial and error gameplay before success is achieved. On the other hand, an extreme example of a low difficulty, high flexibility situation is Fire Emblem 8 on easy mode, wherein enemies are so weak they can do basically anything and beat the game easily. However, these are not the only possible kinds of situations. Even though there tends to be a trade-off between flexibility and difficulty, it is still possible for there to be high difficulty, high flexibility situations, and low difficulty, low flexibility situations. A low difficulty, low flexibility map will be an easy map with little variety. Examples of these can tend to be very early chapters, or isolated chapters where your units are pre-deployed. Maps like these can be fun on the first playthrough, but they are not very replayable because they tend to play the same every single time. There's not much variety between the playthroughs because of limited options for units. An example of this would be Chapter 5X in Fire Emblem 8, where you get 4 pre-deployed units. The map plays the same every single time you do it. But lastly, there are cases where you can have high difficulty and high flexibility, and these tend to be the maps where Fire Emblem really shines. One great example of this will be Fire Emblem Fates Conquest, Chapter 10. By the time you reach this chapter, you've already had a few maps under your belt, likely causing the characteristics of your army to diverge greatly from that of your other playthroughs. And the map itself is genuinely challenging, but there are many ways to approach it and many ways to complete it. Chapter 10 can play extremely differently if you're able to take down Takumi early to stop him from freezing the dragon veins, or if you're forced to cede territory and fail to obtain the valuable treasure from the villages. In my opinion, Fire Emblem is at its best when there are multiple ways to achieve victory, but each of those ways needs to require some degree of thought or planning. Neither difficulty or flexibility alone is sufficient to create a memorable experience, especially on repeat playthroughs. If you lack difficulty, then the maps just end up being a mindless stomp. But if you lack flexibility, the map is just a repetitive puzzle. If you lack both, then the map is just boring. That isn't to say that there isn't a place for maps like these, because having a variation in map types is very important for pacing. You can't only have difficult map after difficult map after difficult map, where you risk exhausting the player. So now the question is, how do we achieve a satisfactory amount of difficulty while retaining gameplay flexibility? Increasing difficulty is really easy. All you need to do is make the enemy stats higher. But how do you do that while still having an interesting gameplay experience without railroading the player down specific paths? One way to do this is to add additional systems for the player to interact with to gain power. Naturally, having more customization options per character can make individual playthroughs much more varied. But simply having a large number of options is not enough to achieve flexibility. There needs to be meaningful differences between them and sufficient balance to make many of them useful. Fire Emblem Awakening has a large variety of skills and inheritance options, but there are some options that are very easy to achieve and basically trivialize the game. The Nosferatu build paired with the Crom is very simple to do and can beat the majority of the game extremely easily. If there are many options, but there are a few that are just more powerful and require less work than the others, then the true number of viable options is low. Furthermore, having too much freedom can be the same as having no freedom at all. We can see this in Fire Emblem Three Houses and Fire Emblem Engage, where any unit can class change into nearly any class. So there's no reason to go for anything but the best class. Why use any other melee class if you can just turn everyone into a Wyvern Knight? I think Fire Emblem Fates Conquest did it best by having a large but limited number of class options with mutually exclusive access locked behind supports, meaning that while every character has access to many options, it's not possible to build everyone into the exact same optimal combat unit. Furthermore, powerful builds like Nosferatu sweeping are still possible in Conquest, and extremely powerful, but it requires a complicated web of class changes, and even then, it still can't beat the game on its own, since solo units can easily be isolated and taken out by enemy status stabs and stacking debuffs, which are plentiful in the endgame. In most normal circumstances, you'll still need a whole team to beat the game. And this leads to my second point. Having a full team should matter. Ideally, units should be able to contribute to your team's power level even if they're not very good. If weaker units are a complete liability, then the number of options that the player has goes down drastically, as you're practically forced to depend only on stronger options. Fates managed to make even weak units useful with a pair-up system where dual strikes allow weaker units to assist stronger units, or for weaker units to piggyback off of the stronger unit's power to still remain combat relevant, even if they personally are not very strong. And Fire Emblem Engage also has systems, such as a break system, which can allow weaker units to still be useful, either by triggering a break or taking advantage of it by attacking an enemy that cannot counter. Other mechanics like chain attacks and true damage from Alira's personal skill are also great for this, because it can allow units to do surprisingly decent damage even if their offenses are extremely poor. Systems like these make it just better to have more units, which will encourage using more units, and thus increases the variety of your army. None of these systems are perfect, but these are the kinds of things that assist in increasing the flexibility of your game. These small edges make the game more complicated, but ultimately it lets you convert planning into power. And this leads to my final point. Fire Emblem is at its best when you can leverage many small, incremental advantages into what eventually becomes a substantial power boost. This is featured even in early Fire Emblem games, and the game design is at its core about accumulating multiple conditional advantages, terrain bonuses, weapon triangle advantages, support bonuses, and so on and so forth. Taking full advantage of every mechanic can and should you bring more success, because it forces you to adapt to the specific situation of the map. And what it also does is it allows you to convert your thinking, planning, and positioning into tangible power in the game. Being able to punch up against more powerful enemies by having a plan, or otherwise by not leveraging these advantages you'll be much more likely to fail. And this is what I think separates Fire Emblem from other strategy RPGs, which so often feel more like regular RPGs on a grid. In Fire Emblem, you can convert knowledge and strategy into concrete power, and that is what makes it so great. So, where does that leave us? Difficulty is essential to the Fire Emblem experience, but is not necessarily interesting for its own sake. Difficulty creates limitation, which is necessary to create the context where finding creative and intelligent solutions to problems is rewarded. Flexibility is immensely important to having a varied and replayable experience, but without difficulty to rein it in, it is meaningless. Fire Emblem shines when the difficulty-flexibility dynamic is at a good balance and there is a variety of interesting options that you can use to achieve victory. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think about difficulty and flexibility in the comments down below. Are these things that you value or pay attention to when you play Fire Emblem? Where do your favorite maps fall on the difficulty-flexibility spectrum? If you would like to see more videos like this, please subscribe and also check out my Twitter and Patreon. That's it.